When you think of slavery, you most likely picture an African American on a white southern plantation. But the roots of slavery extended to Native American communities too. So in this episode, we take a closer look at Cherokee freed people, why emancipation didn't necessarily mean freedom, and the complicated relationship with the federal government, as we answer, how did slavery impact Cherokee Nation? Welcome to America, a history podcast. I'm Liam Heffernan, and every week we answer a different question to understand the people, the places, and the events that make the USA what it is today. Joining me on the podcast this week is Dr. Andi Bawden, who completed her PhD at UEA in 2017. It considered Cherokee freed people and was interested in questions of race, identity, citizenship, and sovereignty in 19th and 20th centuries. Hello, Andi.
Hello. Hi, Liam.
Great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's been a while. Just to give context, we studied together, 10 years ago now?
Yeah, I think it is actually.
Yeah.
Good decade ago.
But you have since gone on to be far smarter than me and get your PhD, and I've gone on to make podcasts. So here we meet.
Oh, I don't know about that. Reunited at last. That's what the people have been waiting for.
Yeah, the glorious reunion. Right. So we're going to go into something quite deep today, I think, that I'm sure most of our listeners will know very little about, in that I'm sure some people might have some knowledge of Native American history, some people might have some knowledge of slavery, but that might not crisscross too much. So let's establish some context first and talk about how slavery had actually embedded itself within not just Native American communities in general, but within Cherokee Nation sort of before the Civil War.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. We kind of tend to compartmentalize histories in various ways, whether that's the history of slavery, the African American experience, whether that's Native American slavery or Native American history. And we can become quite siloed in how we think about people in history and their lived experience. But often the world is much messier than that. And those groups, if you like, which are these kind of broad labels, are often much more entangled than we might think when we create those distinctions. So we're going to talk about the Cherokee Nation particularly today. And something that's really important to establish from the beginning is probably how much variety there is if we were thinking about kind of Native Americans and slavery, which is that some of those communities would never have engaged in any kind of slavery at all. Others might have a history of taking slaves, taking war captives, but later never engaged in what we would consider kind of racial slavery that we see kind of spreading across the Americas. Whereas we have others like the Cherokees, the Cherokee Nation, who do start to incorporate it into their society, their hierarchies, their economy. You know, it has this kind of broad-reaching, it becomes very omnipresent, a bit like we saw in the American South, that more kind of traditional understanding, which is that slavery and its practice and is entangled up in everything. So there's a huge amount of variety. So we should keep that in mind, that the kind of the Cherokee story, whether that's its engagement with slavery, its sort of Civil War, post-Civil War experience, or even kind of how they are engaging or think about race or their kind of communities now, might be or will be relatively unique. So there isn't a kind of cookie cutter history here that we can point to. But I'm happy to talk a little bit about the Cherokee Nation's adoption of slavery, which was quite a kind of creeping process at the tail end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. And some of that, and I'm going to speak in broad brushstrokes, so don't bore your listeners to tears, is about modeling and mirroring what's happening with their American neighbors in the United States, or, you know, what had become the United States at that point. They're under quite a lot of pressure to conform, to prove that they're civilized and they're not savages, and, you know, speaking in the language of the time. So, and some of that is just quite superficial things, like maybe thinking about how they dress. They're endeavoring to accumulate wealth. They're changing their lifestyles to fit in more and therefore feel more protected from kind of encroachment, that kind of thing. So it's a somewhat defensive position. And for some members, what would become the kind of the elite start to adopt practices like slavery. So it's a way to engage in the economy. It's a way of saying that they're invested in this similar sort of hierarchies and social organizations. So if you think about geographically where they are, they're Georgia, South Carolina, they are surrounded by what would become the Confederacy. So if you were mirroring your white neighbors in an attempt to show that you're not that different, or honestly, just because wealth is quite alluring anyway, right? Like, it doesn't necessarily need to be entirely about self-preservation. It can be attractive in its own right. And some of that encompasses slavery because of where they are. So that's kind of, that it slowly becomes embedded over time as certain portions of the Cherokee Nation become more and more invested in those kind of practices, lifestyles, social mores. But it's quite a split, a bit like you see in the South anyway, the slaveholding South, which is that really slaveholding is only possible for a very small, very wealthy elite. So we're not seeing widespread slaveholding or enslavement by Cherokees. It's the kind of, I'm going to make a figure up, but let's say the most wealthy, powerful 10% are engaging in the practice. And there were huge swathes of the Cherokee population that thought it ran counter to their values and traditional Cherokee ways. So there are kind of moral questions about holding people in slavery and everything that comes with that. Similar debates that you were seeing across the US are happening within the Cherokee Nation on a much smaller scale.
Yeah, and I mean, firstly, there's such an irony, isn't there, in adopting slavery to not appear as savages, but which is
Right.
ridiculous. Um, it's that value system that confuses me because, as you say, they were mirroring, they were trying to appear to conform to what was expected of them by the white settlers, basically. So I'm wondering if that was reflected in the way that they treated their slaves in sort of the conditions that they kept their slaves under. Was it a bit more humane, for want of a better word?
It's an interesting question because for a very long time there was an idea, say in the historiography, and that Native American slaveholders would be kinder than their white counterparts. But actually, there isn't really any evidence that is the case, and there are kind of other things that point to it being much the same. Same levels of violence, coercion, and that kind of thing. It's really interesting, I think, and some of that speaks to kind of like the idea that kind of people that are being overpowered, if you like, by the US would inherently treat each other better, that they would kind of maybe recognize themselves as allies, or cooperate in some form or another. And actually, it seems to me, and this is kind of generally how it's understood now, that it was almost more of a divide and conquer. That you would encourage Native Americans and the enslaved at this time to absolutely not work together. That has the potential to be really dangerous in terms of challenging the status quo or kind of the US. So I suspect in that sense, that kind of, if we're thinking about that kind of exertion of power, not that different, variation as there always would have been between kind of individual slaveholders, but no clear indication at all that it was necessarily more humane. And it's interesting because then we end up with this kind of triangular structure, which is that because the Native American peoples of the Cherokee Nation at this time is also being quite disempowered. So that defensive position is coming out of that huge exertion of power and expansion that the United States is endeavoring to do across the continent. So, and they're caught on the edge of that and are vulnerable to it, which is part of why they're kind of engaging in this mirroring, as a form of protection. It's kind of a way of saying, oh, we're not that different. can you try and treat us as equals? Can you try and treat us as a nation rather than, in the language of the time, kind of savages that can just be brushed aside? So it's all tied up in this really knotty web of power, and in part of a means of ensuring they're not at the bottom is keeping someone else below them.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
We get to the Civil War. Lincoln makes the Emancipation Proclamation. A couple of years later, Civil War ends. Slaves are free. If Cherokee Nation were simply mirroring their counterparts, their white counterparts in the South, then surely at that point, the Cherokee freed people would go back to normal life. They would integrate fully into society. They wouldn't need to keep up this pretense anymore. These hierarchies wouldn't need to exist. It wasn't as easy as that, was it?
No, exactly. So I think by the time the Civil War rolls around, actually these kind of power structures are entirely embedded. Cherokees, or at least the slaveholding Cherokees, are as invested in them as their white counterparts. So kind of you see racial prejudice in much the same way. So you're exactly right. If this was all just a kind of a charade to make it look like we're all just the same and that they weren't actually that bothered, then in theory the Civil War and emancipation and everything that came with that would clear the decks and everyone could just be. But that isn't at all how it plays out. So they remain racially prejudiced against the formerly enslaved, and don't want to incorporate them. Also, ironically, a mirroring, I suppose, what's happening in the US anyway, which is that kind of unwillingness to fully incorporate the formerly enslaved across the US. So there's a huge similarity there, I think.
So let's look at this like weird relationship that then started to emerge between the Cherokee Nation. You had the Cherokee freed people who were slaves, who were looking for citizenship and sort of reintegrate as full members of society. But then you also had the federal government who had their own agenda, not just against the Native Americans, but in the wake of like restoration and everything else. So how did that kind of play out for the new freed people?
So by the end of the Civil War, the relationship between the Cherokee Nation and the US is quite combative, and it has been for a long time. It's part of the problem, well, not problem, but that's nothing new. It's been adversarial and aggressive for decades at this point. By the Civil War, the Cherokees have been forcibly relocated out to Indian Territory, so what's now Oklahoma. They've had to reconstitute themselves in a new alien place, only for probably by the moment they've managed to, the dust has settled for Civil War to erupt anyway. So they're already in a defensive position with the US. And when the Civil War hit, the Cherokees split along similar lines. So into what's been known since as the Southern Cherokees, who'd aligned themselves with the Confederacy. And no surprises here that included, or was primarily made up of the slave-holding Cherokees, right? And the Confederacy is the side that will protect their interest, and presumably the side that they feel most aligned with generally anyway, culturally, versus what was known as loyal Cherokees who allied themselves with the Union. So we see a similar split straight down the middle of the Cherokee Nation as we do with the Civil War. So when that wraps up, there's a need to kind of not only reconcile between the US and the Cherokee Nation as a whole, but also to bring those two halves of the Cherokee Nation back together as well. And the US uses this opportunity to effectively, as leverage, to further their agenda. So they require the Cherokees to emancipate all their slaves, and they require them to give them full membership, all the rights of Native Cherokees is how it's phrased in the treaty. So they have to sign this treaty between the Cherokees and the US, and then that treaty then stands as a document agreeing terms of reconciliation, if you like, that ends hostilities between the Cherokees and the US. And that's the mechanism by which the federal government can kind of interfere in this dispute between Cherokees or the Cherokee kind of leadership and freed people. So they can kind of always, for decades, keep pointing back to it and say, we agreed that you would give your freed people all the rights of Native Cherokees. So it lays the kind of foundations for this kind of ongoing dispute that just steadily gets more and more hostile and more kind of antagonistic over the status of former slaves, which we see over the next 40 years or so. It's maybe the most divisive issue within the Cherokee Nation in the decades following the Civil War.
So I see what you mean about the federal government's involvement, and I kind of get what was in it for them. I don't understand what was in it for Cherokee Nation to essentially sacrifice Cherokee freed people who were, by all intents and purposes, part of their community, be it former slaves or not, and they've just basically fed them to the government. What was in it for them?
Some of it, I think, is that they've almost just settled into antagonism. Like, they refuse to agree. This whole dispute would have disappeared immediately if they'd said, great, we would love to have the freed people back and we would love to give them all the rights as everyone else. But, so have them back on an entirely equal footing as other members. And if they had done that, the whole dispute goes away. It doesn't really matter that they've got those terms in the treaty because no one is breaking them. There's nothing to argue about. So it's a missed opportunity to be able to kind of like own that situation. And I think, in my opinion, what it really comes down to is two things. Some of it is just straightforward racism. Some of it is that they don't see those formerly enslaved people as part of their community, and don't think that they should have to make room for them and incorporate them. They don't think that they should have to do that. It, like, just inherently are like, well, those people are not Cherokees. And it's also partly about preserving their own decision making over who gets to be defined as Cherokee and who does not. So some of this is about, or a lot of this is about self-government and saying to the US, we get to make our own decisions about who is Cherokee and who is not. And we have decided that these people are not. So it's really messy. And those things become increasingly entangled to the point where they're considered oppositional in nature, that to give in on this issue would be to kind of hand over the keys to the nation and admit defeat. So those positions just become more and more entrenched. The more the US and the Cherokees knock heads, it just becomes harder and harder to give on this issue. So that's why I think it doesn't go away. There is no easy incorporation. They are quite clearly made unwelcome, at least by decision makers. There are plenty of Cherokees that are delighted to see their neighbours return and want them to be fully incorporated and think that that is an entirely reasonable position. So it's not kind of clear cut that there's kind of necessarily prejudice against freed people, and that's a kind of a blanket opinion. But the people that tended to be in power tended to think otherwise, largely because they are the same old, they come from the same families that were perhaps slaveholding, or at least the kind of wealthy elite themselves, the ones that kind of hold the power politically.
And I think it's interesting because I think there's a natural, almost discriminatory view of history that Native American history is treated in a fairly two-dimensional way, and when you dig down into it as you have, you look at any microcosm of society, and the same sort of prejudice, the same discrimination can play out within, and the same hierarchies can develop within those pockets of society as well. It's not, it's, it's interesting, but as I mentioned at the start of this podcast, people either look at Native American history or they look at slavery. I've seen very little, in fact, I've seen no work besides your own that kind of looks at that overlap between the two. So I'm just wondering how we've remembered or not remembered Cherokee freed people over time.
So I think it's really interesting the way things kind of disappear, and I think that entire stories disappear, or in this case, kind of a sort of a type of person, if you like. So there's kind of a field known as Black Indian Studies, which is endeavouring to look at exactly that intersection between those two histories. And it's been arguably flourishing relatively in the last sort of, let's say 15 years or so, certainly 21st century, which is that people are starting to try and pick that apart and be like, well, if we view those histories in silos, how do we ever talk about Black Cherokees who might have been kind of, they are kind of African in descent, look Black, but perhaps grew up speaking Cherokee and eating Cherokee food, very culturally Cherokee? Or, like, how do you get at the question of, for in that moment of becoming free, back in the 1860s and the Civil War, why do they stay in the Cherokee Nation instead of go somewhere else? If we start to kind of assume that to be Black in America is to be a certain kind of, or to value certain things or have certain goals, and you lose that potential variability. And in the same way for like native nations, they are all different. And if we view kind of Native American or American Indian as a sort of all-encompassing term, and they are all entirely homogenous within that, so there's no difference between the Cherokees, the Choctaws, the Sioux, then you lose all of this detail, and kind of it becomes incredibly bland and unhelpful history, let alone the variation within, say, the Cherokee Nation. What really struck me in my research was how split the nation continued to be. So there was never a clear position about, should we incorporate freed people, shouldn't we? How do we do that? What rights do we give them, and do we have to give them all the rights? Can we find a way to parcel out a sort of in between, almost citizenship? No clear opinion, and endless debate, and that's happening ad infinitum. Across different nations, different corners of the US, different states, different cities, they're all having their own version of this. But the specifics are where the real kind of interests lie for me. How does power work in this situation that is different to what's happening in, I don't know, Charleston? It's a much more complicated space, racially, culturally. It's a much more contested history. The land is more contested at this point, this kind of part of the world. Constant redrawing of boundaries, constant kind of displacement of people, buying, selling all the time. It's a rapidly changing landscape. But yeah, but there's certainly much more interest now, and some of that comes out of quite high profile cases in this area. So, this dispute, my work is primarily interested in the sort of 40 years after the Civil War. So it took me through to Oklahoma statehood, basically. But what had brought it to my attention was a huge legal case where Cherokee freed people sued the Cherokee Nation for discrimination and said that they had been denied their rights, which is a direct legacy of that historical moment. They are pointing to this treaty from 1866 and saying, you agreed there that we would have all the rights of native Cherokees and we would like them. And we are entitled to them. And that's in 2004, 2007. And there's been kind of, there's a similar one for the Creeks and a similar one for the Choctaws. But that kind of stuff starts making kind of national, international headlines as a kind of a historical anomaly, but also a very current and very emotive issue for those people. people. That's about their kind of identity and inclusion in their community and acknowledgement of why they belong there. And they're kind of standing up 150 years later saying, this isn't good enough. It's in a lot of respects, some of this history is really difficult. It's about discrimination. It's about exclusion. It's about kind of unreasonable expressions of power on various sides. But in other respects, for freed people, this is about a really long struggle to say, we are here and we're not going anywhere. And not only are we staying, but we want you to acknowledge us and to kind of make us full and valued members of your community. And that's 150 years. That's a really powerful story of a kind of a battle for justice for those people. And kind of the numbers are not huge. The size of the Cherokee Nation is not huge. It was not huge at the time of the Civil War. We're not talking about kind of hundreds of thousands of people, but it's really important. I think there's something there's a lot of positive stories tied up in here as well about kind of resistance and seeking justice and kind of not giving up, that are important and could easily be lost as well. At least, some of that mirrors the civil rights movement we are familiar with, and other parts of this history are very, very different. The context is different, their struggle is different, the time frame is stretched in some ways. So there's a lot tied up in this history that is very important, I think.
This episode of America, a history podcast, was produced, edited, and hosted by me, Liam Heffernan. A special thanks to our guest this week, Dr. Andi Bawden, and if you're interested to know more, you should check out some of the resources that we've added to the show notes. Additionally, if you can leave us a rating and review, that would make us feel awesome and validate all the hard work that goes into making this podcast. Next time, we take a look at one of the Republican presidential candidates for 2024, as I'm joined by Dr. Emma Long to answer, who is Ron DeSantis?